At the beginning of this century, there was no living European who had seen Lhasa, this forbidden city of Tibet. Foreigners were not welcome. Tibet was one of the last secret places on Earth, a mystery that the 19th century had left for the 20th to explore. It was their Buddhist religion the Tibetans wished to preserve from outside influences, this and their fragile independence. Like a no-man's land behind the Himalayas, Tibet kept apart three empires. To the south was British India. To the west, the expanding Russian Empire. To the east and north, Imperial China. The Chinese had always claimed Tibet to be part of China, a claim they had only rarely been able to enforce. In the 1930s and 40s, a few outsiders had visited Tibet. Mostly British political representatives come up from India. These pictures from the films they took reveal Tibet as a medieval country, devoted to its spiritual and earthly leader, the Dalai Lama. To the British in India, Tibet had been a convenient buffer along the northern frontier of the empire. Tibet's isolation had served the British well. But by 1950, the British had left India. The last British representative was gone from Lhasa. The garden parties at the Dekilinka, where the British had stayed, were but a memory. There was a new world order now. In China, racked by war since the founding of the Republic in 1911, Mao's forces had finally triumphed. The communists were now ready to enforce the old claim that Tibet was part of China. In Peking, they solemnly declared that Tibet was next to be liberated. There is today just one European, an Austrian, who had first-hand experience of what happened in Lhasa in the last days of 1950.
I had been living in Lhasa for 5 happy years. After escaping from a British internment camp in India, together with Peter Aufschneider, we had reached Lhasa, became employees of the Tibetan government. I also became friend of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. By 1949, the Chinese threatened Tibet with what they called liberation. Everybody in Lhasa knew that the Chinese were going to carry out this threat.
The Tibetans loved their independence and were clearly entitled to enjoy it. They had no wish to be liberated. The little Tibetan army was hurriedly reorganized under the supervision of a cabinet minister. Monks and officials were trained as officers. New regiments were raised and the richer classes called upon to furnish and equip another 1,000 men. Not only the material means of defense were mobilized, but also the spiritual forces of the people. Religion, the most powerful element in the life of the country, had to be invoked. All the monks in Tibet were ordered to attend public services. Offerings were doubled, rare and powerful amulets brought out of old chests. Meanwhile, Radio Peking was already sending out messages in Tibetan promising that Tibet would soon be freed. As the threat of liberation grew, it seemed as if the entire population of Tibet had packed the narrow streets of Lhasa in pious enthusiasm for the religious festivals which in 1950 surpassed in pomp and splendor anything I had ever seen. Despite the threat from the Chinese, the ceremonies vital to the running of the state had to continue. 4 weeks after the great New Year festival, the 20,000 monks of the monasteries around Lhasa descended once again into the city for the second prayer festival. The people believed with rock-like faith that the power of religion would suffice to protect their independence. The main event of the second prayer festival was the chastisement of evil spirits. The full force of the tantric order was mobilized. In front of the central cathedral, the abbots of the great monasteries were challenged to throw dice to decide the fate of Tibet. Two scapegoats, symbolizing evil, were the challengers. Representatives of the Tibetan government supervised the contest. They took no chances. The dice were loaded. The faces of the abbots' dice all marked with sixes, those of the demons with ones. The moment ritual victory was won for Tibet, the scapegoats were driven from the town. The prayers ended with a great procession to the foot of the Potala Palace. The procession symbolized the dedication of his people to the Dalai Lama. And the new year, appropriately and successfully observed, the people of Lhasa would in normal times relax and agree that they had good reason to look forward to another year of peace and prosperity. But this year, the prayers failed, and the game of dice. The evil omens multiplied. Monsters were born. There was an earthquake. In vain, the government sent monks to the centers of ill omen to banish the evil spirits. When, in blazing summer weather, a gargoyle on top of the cathedral began to spout water, people were beside themselves in terror. The town buzzed with rumors. The state oracle was frequently consulted. His prophecies were dark. A powerful foe threatens our sacred land from the north and east. Our religion is in danger. The Dalai Lama, the incarnation of Chenrezig, patron god of Tibet, just 15 years old, was hurriedly declared of age. The old regent stepped down. On October the 7th, 1950, the Chinese attacked the Tibetan frontier in 6 places simultaneously and swept aside the little Tibetan army. Should the Dalai Lama stay or flee? The Tibetan government could not make such an important decision. The gods must have the last word. The state oracle said, "Flee." I felt like a spectator at a play who foresaw the tragic denouement and was saddened by the inevitable end, but had to sit out the last act. The Dalai Lama had an escort of 40 nobles, an army of cooks and servants, and an endless train of 1,500 pack animals. The curtain had rung down on feudalism, and they knew it. They headed southwards across the Tsangpo River along the old trade route to India. News of the Dalai Lama's approach soon reached the Tibetan town of Gyantse. Small white stones were laid along the sides of the streets to ward off evil spirits. Incense fires burned in welcome. Monks and nuns flocked from the monasteries and convents, and the whole population waited for hours to receive their king and beg him not to leave them. Every place in which the Dalai Lama spent a night was automatically consecrated as a chapel. From Gyantse, the party carried on across the Himalayas towards India. I saw the young god king riding slowly by on his grey horse. The enemy was in the land, and the ruler's flight was only the first step towards greater misfortunes. 16 days after leaving Lhasa, the caravan halted in the Chumbi Valley on the borders of India.
I stayed with His Holiness in the Chumbi Valley for 3 more months, still believing that we might be able to return to Tibet, that the world would listen to the cries of Tibet to stay as an independent country. But then I realized it was the end of the old Tibet, so I said goodbye to the Dalai Lama. Now a communist country was occupying their home, so my sadness was of course very, very great, because I knew that I won't ever see my friends in Tibet again.
In 1951, the Chinese Red Army entered Lhasa. That summer, an agreement was reached, and the Dalai Lama returned. For the next few years, life was to continue outwardly much the same as it always had, dominated by religion and the yearly cycle of ceremonies considered vital to the well-being of the country. The treaty concluded between Tibet and China was the first for over 1,000 years. The Tibetans had no choice but to sign. The country's future role was defined as being part of the Chinese motherland. In return, the agreement appeared to pledge no change in the status and powers of the Dalai Lama and promised protection for the Tibetan religion. At first, the Chinese were not much in evidence, but within a year, there were several thousand in Lhasa. Food and fuel became scarce. Relations between Chinese and Tibetans deteriorated. In 1954, the Dalai Lama was invited on a long visit to Peking. The journey to China was filmed by Jigme Tering, a Tibetan official whose wife, Mary La, tells the story.
His Holiness Party left Lhasa accompanied by the Chinese commissioner. The whole of Lhasa had come to see the Dalai Lama off. On the banks of the Kichu River, hundreds of people burnt incense to wish His Holiness a safe journey. They were afraid he might never be allowed to return. We crossed the river in yak hide boats, tied together, and the people watching did their best to cheer up, but they were very sad to see His Holiness go. The Chinese said that this visit to Peking would help the Dalai Lama by widening his knowledge. Monks and about 100 officials were also invited. They had to take their own ponies and tents and servants. It was very lovely on the road. As we went southeast, it was thickly wooded, with tall pine trees, rather like Scotland. Though the countryside was very beautiful, there was not a very happy atmosphere. It was here that we heard that the whole town of Gyantse had been washed away in a terrible flood that drowned more than 2,000 people, including many of our friends. After 12 days, the way became very dangerous, as the Chinese were taking us along the unfinished road they were building for motor vehicles. We had to walk for hours. The mud was about 9 inches deep. This region is so wet that often rain washed away the new road, and once a bridge was damaged. The Chinese soldiers repaired it with logs. We had begun to meet a lot of Chinese soldiers on the journey. The Chinese and our Tibetan officials were having discussions as we traveled. Relations didn't seem to be very good. Several Chinese that I had met in Lhasa were supervising the road building. They came to see us, to wish us a happy journey. They said we should take an interest in learning political science and join the Chinese. Then we would be much safer in the future. After 24 days traveling, which we organized ourselves, the Chinese met us in Timor, in Poyo, which is still in Tibet. From here, it was the Chinese who arranged our accommodation and transport. Most of our servants went back to Lhasa with the mules. Now there were new Russian jeeps for His Holiness group. About 30 jeeps for officials and about 50 trucks for the junior officials and servants. In Peking, the Chinese looked after us very well. Everyone was hoping that relations would improve. We were taken to see factories and ancient places, while our officials had to attend endless meetings with the Chinese. They were having talks about setting up the preparatory committee for the autonomous region of Tibet, as our country was now to be known. All our officials who were concerned looked worried and tired, but things seemed to go quite well. After 5 months in Peking, we started our return journey to Lhasa through eastern Tibet. His Holiness visited many monasteries and gave sermons at each important town. Thousands came from far away to greet him. The people showed him much faith and love and were so happy they threw themselves towards him. At heart, the Chinese did not like this devotion to His Holiness. By now, the new motor road to Lhasa had been completed, and the journey that had taken 24 days a year earlier could now be done in a week. Huge crowds gathered to see His Holiness at all the stopping places along the way. In Lhasa, everyone turned out to welcome His Holiness back. They had feared that the Chinese might not allow him to come home. There were now many more Chinese in Lhasa. They had built a bridge across the Kichu River. After going to the cathedral to give thanks for his safe return, His Holiness was escorted to the noble Inca, his summer palace.
In Peking, there had been many speeches about the great friendship between Tibetans and Chinese, but there was no great friendship. At home, the people kept quiet, because the Dalai Lama was like a hostage in Peking. But after his return, fighting broke out in eastern Tibet. Attacks on their religion had inflamed the people. The Chinese tried to be conciliatory, but Tibetan resistance grew. In 1958, a Chinese military post was annihilated within 25 miles of Lhasa. It was clear that a serious explosion was in the making. In January 1959, the Chinese again asked the Dalai Lama to go to Peking. He declined, explaining that he had to take important religious examinations that month. Although he was already the ruler of Tibet, he still had to prove that his religious knowledge made him worthy of office. For 3 months, the Dalai Lama was to be questioned and examined in each of the 3 great monasteries of Lhasa. For him, it was the culmination of 18 years of study. At each monastery, a reception tent was put up to welcome the Dalai Lama. Monks queued for his blessings before he was escorted on up to the monastery. Religion was at the very heart of Tibet. A third of the male population of Tibet were monks. Monks held most of the senior administrative posts, jointly with lay officials. The senior member of the Tibetan cabinet was a monk. Everything in Tibet was subordinate to religion. The Dalai Lama himself was a god incarnate. Senior members of the Tibetan government accompanied the Dalai Lama to the ceremonies. Cabinet meetings were held at the monasteries throughout the 3 months of the examinations. In all my years in Tibet, wrote Heinrich Harrer, I never met anyone who expressed the slightest doubt about Lord Buddha's teachings. It must have infuriated the Chinese communists, for whom all this religion was simply superstition, a tranquilizing poison used by capitalists to oppress the people, that even 10 years after their takeover of Tibet, religion still dominated what was supposed to be part of atheist China. In the whole history of Tibet, there was no record of there ever having been any popular opposition to the system. The monks looked after the spiritual needs of the people, and whatever the cost, the people supported the monasteries. In China, the revolution had grown out of the discontent of the ordinary people. In Tibet, it was the ordinary people who were the main opponents of the Chinese. The Tibetan government and the Dalai Lama had constantly striven for accommodation and compromise. They must have known it was hopeless to oppose the might of China. The last stage of the Dalai Lama's examination took place in Lhasa in the Jokang, the central cathedral. By early 1959, the situation in Tibet was deteriorating fast. The guerrillas had grown so strong, they were able to overthrow a large Chinese garrison at Setang, not far from Lhasa, and there were repeated attacks on Chinese convoys. Tension was high, but nothing could interrupt the spiritual preoccupations of the Tibetan government. Shortly after the successful completion of his examination, early in March 1959, the Dalai Lama was invited to attend a display at the Chinese barracks in Lhasa. To the Tibetans, this was seen as a trap. They believed that the Chinese would seize the Dalai Lama. Thousands swarmed to the Norbalinka summer palace to protect him. It was the beginning of an uprising against the Chinese. A Chinese emissary was stoned to death. Campers from eastern Tibet took up defensive positions and were soon joined by Tibetan soldiers. The Tibetan people had taken matters into their own hands.
The rebel bandits proceed with their reckless preparations for war. watched and restricted, the Dalai Lama was now held under duress in the Nobulinka.
Unknown to the Chinese, the Dalai Lama had slipped away from Lhasa by night. The last Tibetan cabinet meeting had denounced all agreements with China on the grounds of persistent violations by China and had proclaimed Tibet independent.
Their patience finally exhausted, the military area command called an emergency meeting 7 hours after the outbreak of the revolt. They resolved to resolutely suppress the rebellion and safeguard the unity and territorial integrity of the motherland. The counterattack begins. Our troops attack and occupy the rebel positions on Yowang Hill. Working hand in hand with foreign reactionaries, betrayed the motherland, and lacking the support of the people, they quickly crumbled. Many who were deceived or coerced into joining the ranks of the rebels are now surrendering their arms. Two days later, the rebel units in Lhasa and its outskirts were completely crushed.
The Dalai Lama's route took him this time southeastwards across the high passes of the Himalayas towards Assam. Peking's version of the Dalai Lama's escape was that the Dalai Lama had been abducted under duress by the rebels, a few reactionaries manipulated by foreign powers acting against the will of the people.
Lhasa citizens participate in the work of clearing up the debris. Telephone and power lines are repaired. Schools are reopened. There is a sudden threefold increase in the number of students attending school. Examples from real life teach these children the distinction between good people and bad people.
In India, the Dalai Lama was greeted by a tremendous popular demonstration of world concern and relief, and by an embarrassed Indian government. There were outstanding differences about the border between India and Tibet. Nehru was afraid of provoking the Chinese, who were by now firmly in control of Tibet.
The peasants of Tibet, who lived like animals through countless generations of serfdom, have stood up. The joyful days which they have long dreamed about are here at last. The serfs are now free. The government issues seeds to the peasants as interest-free loans. These are truly the seeds of happiness. This is the first time in thousands of years that the Tibetan peasants are able to grow crops for themselves. The oppression and exploitation which the Tibetan peasants suffered for centuries have now been relegated to the past. In truth, springtime has come to Tibet. Lhasa's 20,000 inhabitants hold a grand rally on the square before the Potala Palace. The five-starred red flag of our motherland flutters high over Lhasa.
The first of 90,000 Tibetan refugees followed the Dalai Lama across the Himalayas into India and Nepal. They told of the suppression of their religion and brutal treatment by the Chinese. India was not anxious to publicize the camps, built to receive the refugees on the hot plains beneath the Himalayan foothills. The Chinese were making threatening charges about India harboring reactionaries. Nehru was dismayed and concerned. The refugees in these camps were escaping what the International Commission of Jurists condemned as the systematic killing, imprisonment, and deportation of those Tibetans who opposed Chinese policies in Tibet. Unaccustomed to the heat and humidity of the plains, the refugees were found work constructing roads in the hills of northern India. There had never been much need for access to India's northern border. In British times, no country could have had a less aggressive neighbor. Now things were different. Nehru, the great believer in peaceful coexistence, was about to find out why British political officers in Lhasa in the first half of this century had quietly encouraged the Tibetans to keep the Chinese at arm's length. In 1962, Indian border posts on the frontier were overrun by the Chinese. It was for Nehru the final disillusionment with the idea of peaceful coexistence with China. In India, the Dalai Lama was treated as an honored guest. He gratefully acknowledged the help that had been given to his people. For all the refugees, the Dalai Lama continued to provide a focus for their hopes and devotion. In exile, the refugees were held together by their religion and the presence, real and symbolic, of the Dalai Lama. Under the Chinese, Tibet was as much a mystery as it had ever been. Few journalists were allowed into the country, and those who were permitted had usually shown themselves to have been sympathetic to the Chinese. In the early 1960s, a British journalist, Stuart Gelder, visited Tibet and filmed what he saw.
On the land, there is no sign of mechanization being introduced. The harvest is still sown and reaped as it was in ancient times. And even the help of the Chinese soldiers seen here doesn't speed up the operation by very much.
When we arrived in Tibet, we were aware of reports of Chinese atrocities, that the Chinese were suppressing the Tibetan Buddhist religion. Not true. That the Tibetan people were being brutally oppressed. Not true. That the Chinese were killing and torturing the Tibetan people. Not true.
The Panchen Lama, spiritual brother of the Dalai Lama. On the ladder of reincarnation, the Panchen Lama is in fact on a higher spiritual rung than his refugee brother, and most Tibetan people now regard him as their religious leader. On the other hand, the Chinese have appointed him to preside over the Lhasa communist government. But the somewhat odd divergence of responsibility seems not to worry him at all. Indeed, he described himself to us as being a
Buddhist dialectical materialist revolutionary worker for the people.
After the long drawn-out services to the immortal Buddha, the faithful move on to their play acting, marathon performances rooted in antiquity, which are performed by monks. Today, on the top of the maypole, casting a benevolent smile on the people below, is a portrait of the new face the Tibetans must now bow to, the face of their new and mortal leader, Mao Zedong.
The center for Tibetans in exile was in northern India at Dharamsala, just across the Himalayas from Tibet. By 1970, here in the midst of the Himalayan foothills, the Dalai Lama had established, with India's goodwill, a symbolic 2-acre kingdom where the Tibetan religion and the spirit of the old Tibet were kept alive. Dharamsala is a small hill station. the population now mostly Tibetan. In the early 1970s, a trickle of refugees were still crossing the Himalayas from Tibet, and Dharamsala was one place they were looked after. The stories they told about what they had fled from were hard to believe. In Dharamsala, Tibetans were free to teach and practice their religion. By 1979, the Cultural Revolution in China was over. The Dalai Lama was quietly asked by the Chinese to consider returning to Tibet. They agreed that the Tibetans could send delegations to investigate the situation in Tibet. One of the delegates was from London.
I was born in the east part of Tibet, and when I was at the age of 8, I was admitted to the monastery. That's the biggest monastery in Tibet. It's Ndepung Monastery in Lhasa. I went to Tibet after 21 years in exile, last year, 1980, to see what is the condition there. And I went as a part of the second delegation, which is sent by Dalai Lama. In the center of Lhasa, the delegations arrived in front of the Chokhang Cathedral. The Tibetans came in thousands, and not only just came to see us, closing their mouths. They were shouting. They were saying, "Long live Dalai Lama, may his wishes be fulfilled." The Chinese could not say a word. They were just so astonished. And some of the Chinese even did not come after that with us. They just left. They, I think, could not really resist the scene. They could not really face the fact. They feel so embarrassed. I was really surprised. Of course, that was not only in Lhasa, even right in the East Tibet when we first entered. Wherever we went, people gathered and the people came. I think what the Chinese tried to do in the past 21 years, that completely destroy the culture, completely, leave no trace, and then introduce a new communist culture, or Chinese culture in Tibet. I remember that Mao has at one point said that if you make a mistake on a blackboard while writing something, don't try to rewrite it, but completely remove the whole thing and rub the blackboard clean, and then write from the beginning. This monastery at one time had 7,000 monks. And today this is completely destroyed. We did not come across more than 3 towns where we could see some monasteries living. It's not only the old people who has faith in Dalai Lama, who has faith in religion, but even the younger people, they do come forward. I'm sure they don't know what religion is. This will be first time for these kids to see a Lama, and also Lama who can freely speak to them. In the number of schools we visited, what they teach is completely non-Tibetan, because till 1979, no children can learn Tibetan. In textbooks, they say history of China, legend of Tibet. Even the music they play, which is quite often actually in the morning, in the midday, in the evening, and all these musics are Chinese musics, which you can hear in Shanghai or some other towns. Now, when you go to see, to inspect, let's say, the Tibetans are working on the field or a construction of building or road or canal, you will see all the Tibetans are there. But when it comes to the deciding things, like in a position in a government, then you will see the Chinese. The decisions and the powers always with the Chinese. We had 19 to 25 Chinese always with us. When we saw all these monasteries being destroyed and the libraries, all this destroyed, we were really shocked. And we expressed our feeling to these officers, Chinese officers, and number of times we asked, why you destroy these things? And I think they feel very embarrassed because they never try to defend themselves. They actually admit that these destructions were done. But then they say it is not our fault, which means that Communist Party's fault, but it's a gang of four. Sometimes they purposely place religious objects where it should not be. For instance, the money stones, the inscriptions, now they were used to build toilets, to use as a pavements, to insult religion.
Of some 3,500 monasteries and religious sites in Tibet, only parts of 13 are believed to remain today. With this destruction has gone not only one people's cultural identity, but a part of the rich diversity of the world we all live in. It is a tragedy not only for the Tibetans, but for all of us.
Well, it is a tragedy. The Tibetans had a civilization that had developed for 1,300 years. They had an immense literature, largely religious, it's true, and they had developed a very special and very important practice of Buddhism, which they kept up and still keep up in exile. They are a unique people. They have their own language and their own civilization, and surely it's a tragedy to see any civilization dying, even if it is not so long established and so literate and so, I say, use the word polished as the Tibetans.
It is unlikely that the Dalai Lama will return to Tibet in the near future. He believes that he can serve his people better from outside. keeping alive Tibetan culture and world concern for his country. The Chinese, anxious to be accepted in the world today, now openly admit and regret their mistakes in Tibet, for which they blame the Gang of Four. However, a brief period of liberalization this last couple of years appears to have taken a step back since the visits of the delegations. The warmth of the welcome for them has perhaps brought home to the Chinese the strength of Tibetan national feeling, even after 30 years' existence as part of China. If Shangri-La is a state of mind, a dream that we all seem to have some inner need to believe in, and which we placed in Tibet, then Shangri-La may always exist. But if Shangri-La really was this old Tibet, then Shangri-La is gone forever. Change had to come to Tibet. It was in today's terms backward, materially undeveloped. But few can believe that the destruction of this, the old Tibet, has benefited the Tibetan people. Some years after he left Lhasa, Heinrich Harrer wrote the story of his 7 years in Tibet. "Wherever I live," he wrote, "I shall feel homesick for Tibet, for part of my being is indissolubly linked with that dear country. I often think I can still hear the cries of the wild geese as they fly high over Lhasa in the cold, clear moonlight. My heartfelt sympathy is for a people whose will to live in peace and freedom has won so little sympathy from an indifferent world."